Hey guys, it's Chris and welcome back to another House of the Dragon video. Today we're talking about the other families in Westeros that we're going to see besides the Targaryens in House of the Dragon. Now that House of the Dragon is approaching fast, just over 100 and something days away at the end of this year. Really getting excited about it. But I want to talk about some of these other families you may know and how they kind of fit in this time period as well. So obviously House of the Dragon is going to focus on the Targaryens and their civil war. You're going to see a lot of Velaryons, House Velaryon, obviously, as well as House Hightower, as they're kind of intermarried and all that stuff in the family at this time. But what about all these other major houses and families that some of us fell in love with or learned to hate in Game of Thrones? In some cases, they'll be taking a back seat in this story, but they eventually all will come around and have to pick a side, respectively, on the blacks or the greens during the Targaryen Civil War, known as the Dance of the Dragons. But don't forget to pick up your copy of The Crimson Gods. This is my debut fantasy novel. If you like medieval fantasy, dark fantasy, etc., be sure to pick that up. You may enjoy it. This has been out since October, and I really appreciate all you guys who have picked up the book and also left a review on Amazon. Also, really quickly before we get started, and there will be a timestamp in the description below, so you can go ahead and skip ahead to the video, but I want to thank today's sponsor, Ewin Racing. You guys have seen me sitting in these gaming chairs for years and years now on this channel, whether I'm doing live streams, whether I'm sitting here editing all day, or whether I'm streaming on Twitch or whatever. I've used Ewin Racing chairs for many years now, and by far they are the most beautiful chairs, and they're actually made from real leather, not any of that fake leather, pleather stuff, so you do have to take care of these. Ewin Racing chairs will hold up to 550 pounds. It is a steel frame, but you're not going to sit on any steel bars or particle board through the memory foam. You're going to actually be in a comfortable chair. They have the adjustable lumbar pillow as well as the neck pillow. And again, they are adjustable. Simply slide them up and down as you please. One of the great features of these chairs are the 4D adjustable armrests. And these adjust 4 different ways. And of course, these chairs obviously are height adjustable, and these chairs are actually fully reclinable. You can lean them all the way back and actually take a nap in these chairs if you want to, and that may or may not have happened a few times in this very studio. I also want to mention really quickly, these are not just necessarily gaming chairs. These are office chairs as well. They do have all the colorful chairs if you like those styles, but they also have many full black options as well for any office use. So check out Ewin Racing Chairs. There will be a link in the description below to get 20% off any racing chair if you use the code SMOKE. Just go to checkout, enter the code SMOKE, and you will get 20% off any gaming chair no matter how expensive. Thanks again to Ewin Racing for sponsoring today's video. Alright, so what about these other major houses in Westeros that we met during Game of Thrones? Where are they during this time period of House of the Dragon? This is about 170 years before Game of Thrones. And be sure to stick around to the end where we talk about House Stark. They will have a role, not a big one at first, I don't think, but obviously we did see in the teaser trailer they will be involved in some way because we do have a tournament. I think they're going to combine a couple tournaments in the show where we do see House Stark banners, but House Stark doesn't really participate in tournaments. And we'll talk about that here at the end of the video. So let's start with the obvious. House Targaryen. It is in fact about their family falling apart and starting this civil war. Obviously during this time period you're talking about King Viserys I Targaryen and his daughter Rhaenyra Targaryen, who is his named heir. I went into that in many videos before. There's a whole entire House of the Dragon playlist. I'll leave that in the description below as well. So I won't get into House Targaryen too much. Obviously it's the main center of attention here about how they kind of get split in these two teams called the Greens and the Blacks. Obviously we'll also see a major player, as I said before, Daemon Targaryen, otherwise known as the Rogue Prince, will be a huge player and probably essentially the main character in this story. So what about House Lannister? During this time period, they were still a very prominent house, as we saw in Game of Thrones. During this time period, they are, however, not the richest house in Westeros, as that honor belongs to Corlys Velaryon the Sea Snake and House Velaryon, because he sailed the seas and got all these riches from overseas, etc. But they still play a pretty prominent role during this time period, and I think we'll see some members from this house more often than some of these other houses we may mention. Now, during this time period, House Lannister was led by Jason Lannister, who was the Lord at the time, and he did have a twin brother named Tyland as well, and both of them actually vied for the hand of Rhaenyra Targaryen early on, and of course they both failed, and Jason's brother Tyland Lannister actually served as master of ships for King Viserys I, and later on would serve as master of coin for Aegon II Targaryen during his rule. And ironically, although they went after Rhaenyra Targaryen themselves, they both ended up supporting Aegon II and the Greens during the Dance of the Dragons, and actually on the night that King Viserys I dies, it's Tyland Lannister who calls together the small council. And now let's talk about House Baratheon. During this time period, we don't have Stannis or Robert Baratheon obviously being the king at the time. We have Boros Baratheon. He will play a pretty major part in House of the Dragon. I'm actually excited to see Storm's End. This is where he's going to be located. So this is the first time we'll see Storm's End on the screen. And actually, Boros Baratheon is Rhaenyra Targaryen's cousin, as we know that Baratheons and Targaryens are related. And so it was actually surprising when he chose to side with the Greens during the Targaryen Civil War. Without getting into spoilers, Rhaenyra sent one of her children there and counted on his support like so many other houses, but he chose to go with Aegon II and the Greens. But primarily he will remain in Storm's End other than a few battles where he does lead some marches. And his daughter Ellen Baratheon, I believe, will also be featured in the show as well, and she'll have a little part to play as well when people start vying for her hand in marriage, when various kingdoms and families try to make a pact of marriage with her father. And what about House Greyjoy? We're talking about the ancestors of Theon Greyjoy here, obviously from Game of Thrones. And in this time period, the Lord of the Island Islands is known as Dalton Greyjoy, otherwise known as the Red Kraken. He would become known as one of the Ironborn's or Pike's great heroes. And of course, the Greens did send an envoy to Pike to gain his support, but ultimately he did decide to eventually join Rhaenyra Targaryen's cause and became part of the Black Allegiance. So next, let's talk about House Arryn. House Arryn, of course, is in the Vale. We saw that in Game of Thrones with Lysa Arryn being in the Vale with baby Robin on her teat most of the time. But House Arryn will play a role as well because the first wife of Viserys I Targaryen is actually Aemma Arryn. And again, without getting into too many spoilers, she will be in King's Landing for a time. Now, House Arryn will also feature Jane Arryn, who will be a pretty prominent figure in House of the Dragon, I believe. And Jane and House Arryn as a whole would quickly join Rhaenyra's cause and join the Blacks. There's also another Arryn we may see, and that's probably Joffrey Arryn, otherwise known as the Knight of the Gate. And he'll play probably a pretty damn important role towards the end of the show as far as the ends of the Dance of the Dragons, the Civil War itself, as a dragon egg is actually hatched in the Eyrie, so that may come into play after the dance is over. And we'll see how many seasons they do and how far they go. And what about House Tully, the house of Catelyn Stark, or Catelyn Tully before she married Ned? Who really gives a shit? We'll be moving on to House Martell. And as usual, the Dornish are pretty stubborn and stay to themselves pretty much, and that's pretty much the case here. But during this time period, the leader of House Dorne is Corin Martell. He is the Lord of Sunspear during this time period, but pretty much refuses to take part in this Targaryen Civil War, so he doesn't really choose a side. And of course, last but not least, the biggest house in Game of Thrones, House Stark. Will we see them during the Dance of the Dragons or in this show, House of the Dragon? And the answer is probably yes, but not very much until probably the very end. During this time period, the Lord was Cregan Stark, and as usual, the North, even back then, they didn't take part in the politics of the Seven Kingdoms. For the most part, they pretty much stayed to themselves, and it was no different for Cregan Stark until the end of the war, when he does actually come down to King's Landing after the war is over. I won't get to any spoilers here, but he does become Hand of the King for one day before he resigns, and that is known as the Hour of the Wolf. Now, of course, I mentioned earlier we did see House Stark banners during the trailer for House of the Dragon, and this was during a tournament where it's probably going to be established who the Blacks and the Greens are as far as the colored dresses the queens were wearing. But I don't think you'll see any Starks taking part in any jousting or anything because they typically avoided tournaments, and they only really went because they felt like it was their duty to be there as lords, to meet other lords, as a networking opportunity, whatever you want to call it. But generally, House Stark saw tournaments and things like that is just a waste of time. It was a waste of money and a bunch of knights showing off for no fucking reason. Now, of course, Cregan Stark did take part in some way. He did send some troops early on during the war, although he didn't go himself. He stayed back because they had another harvest to go before winter, which is obviously very important to the North, being in Winterfell. There is a very important storyline we will see, however, that kind of plays off the Song of Ice and Fire name itself, and that is when Rhaenyra sends her firstborn son to Winterfell, where she tries to gain the support of the Starks for the Blacks, and essentially she does, and Cregan and her son become fairly close, and they come up with what's called the Pact of Ice and Fire, which is a promise to later marry a Stark to a Targaryen, but that never really comes to fruition, except unofficially about 150 years later, when Rhaegar Targaryen meets Lyanna Stark, and of course they have Jon Snow. Now, of course, there's lots of side things they could be doing, so you will see some of these characters. It's not like you're not going to see them at all, but for the most part, a lot of these families simply stayed at home and just sent some troops here and there in certain battles. But of course, there's a lot we don't know that went on, and that's what's going to be cool to explore, stuff that's not necessarily in the books directly, but there had to be a lot going on as far as other characters and what they were doing during this time period. It wasn't just all a bunch of dragons flying around in the sky, a lot of political stuff going on, a lot of begging to be on my side type of thing, so we'll see a lot of that. But of course, most just won't play a major role, as it's all going to be pretty much House Targaryen, House Velaryon, and a lot of high towers. Anyway, guys, thank you for all the support, especially to you guys on Patreon, and a huge shout out to my executive Patreon SmokeScreen producers. And of course, if you dig what I do here, please give these videos a like, comment, and a share. And of course, be sure to subscribe to get everything as we try to grow this channel to what we intended a couple years ago, to 100,000 subscribers. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.